Hello, my name is Rhys Chatham, and I'm going to be giving a talk on Astrological House Division. I'm speaking to you from my studio in the 6th arrondissement of Paris, France. I'll be giving an overview of most of the major systems of house division and show how they are calculated and which celestial circles they are based on. I hope to answer the question of why use one house system over another? Is one house system better to use than another? How are they different? This talk isn't going to involve any math or spherical trigonometry. What we're going to do is look at the various celestial circles upon which the house divisions are based, determine what they are, and look at how they're calculated without going overly into detail about the math. We will also discuss the symbolic implications of each of the celestial circles. I've divided my talk into 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk a bit about my background as an astrologer. After that, we'll define the 3 categories of house division, and then take a tour of the celestial circles used in calculating the major house division systems. We'll review what exactly a meridian is, the ecliptic, the prime vertical. In short, all the circles and points used in calculating house division systems. We need to do this in order to understand how everything fits together. After doing that, we'll move on to part 3 of the talk and take a detailed look at each of the major house systems. And finally, in part 4, we'll discuss each of their possible symbolic implications. This talk will last 1 hour, so let's jump right in, and I'll tell you a bit about my background as an astrologer and my checkered past as far as working with the astrological house systems is concerned. I grew up in an astrological family. My aunt and uncle were professional astrologers. To pay their rent, they had a daily astrological column in the New York Daily News, but for their serious work, they had a large consulting practice. They used Campanus Houses for their natal readings and predictions and had many satisfied clients. They used Campanus Houses, so I use Campanus Houses also. During the 80s, I wanted to cast my own charts and not have to rely on my aunt and uncle. So I used a method recommended by Marion D. March and Joan McEvers in volume 2 of The Only Way to Learn Astrology, which was a series of books that they had put out in the 70s. They recommended using the Kohn system. Remember, before computer use became prevalent in the 1990s, everybody was casting charts by hand. So I had to learn to do that also. It took me about an hour to cast a natal chart, although I'm sure others could do it somewhat faster than me. But back then it was nothing like it is now, where a chart can be cast in seconds. Regarding the Kohn houses, Robert Hand was using Kohn in the early 80s. This was before Project Hindsight. And he even edited a Kohn book of tables that had a handy form to use to cast the charts by hand. Robert Hand said that he liked the Kohn system because it shifted his 6th house Mars and Placidus to the 5th house when he used Kohn. In any case, I used Kohn during this period and got good results and accurate readings from it. By the end of the 80s, I had started to follow Liz Green and Harold Sesportis at the Psychological School of Astrology. They were using Placidus, so I used Placidus too, and got good results with it. By the end of the 90s, I had shifted to evolutionary astrology, particularly the flavor introduced by Jeffrey Wolf Green, and later worked with the method of Stephen Forrest, which is linked, although not exactly the same. In any case, both of these fellows were using Placidus, So I use Placidus too. And in working with evolutionary astrology, it worked fine using this house system. By the mid-2010s, I had gotten into traditional astrology through the astrologer Lynn Bell. What happened was I had moved to Paris by this time, and I was having coffee in a Parisian cafe with Lynn, and she had been talking about her work with the good daemon of the 11th house and the bad daemon of the 12th house. And she was talking about planetary joys. And I realized that my grasp of these concepts was tenuous at best. So Lynn helpfully explained to me that these ideas were coming out of traditional astrology. So being a perennial student of astrology, well, aren't we all? I went to the astrology university and downloaded some courses on traditional astrology. The first course I downloaded was by Demetra George. She had a course which still is up there, and you can download, called Traditional Astrology 101. Today, I think that that title perhaps is a misnomer, because in fact, the content consisted exclusively of ancient astrology, which is to say Hellenistic astrology. But Hellenistic astrology is a subset of traditional astrology also, along with medieval and Renaissance astrology. And I found the content of a course very, very interesting and mind-blowing, to be honest. So I went ahead and downloaded Traditional Astrology 201, which was another course of hers. And through that, I started to work with Chris Brennan and took his full Hellenistic astrology course and studied with him. After completing his course, I became interested through Ben Dykes' work in medieval astrology, and after that, Renaissance astrology, and began to study with the other Christopher Warnock, who is largely associated with astrological magic and Renaissance astrology. And with Warnock, I studied astrological magic, natal, electional, and horary. And we use exclusively Regiomontanus houses with this work. After studying with Warnock, I joined the School of Traditional Astrology and studied with astrologers such as Deborah Holding, Lee Lehman, Wade Caves, Eve Dembowski. We were working with horary astrology, which is based on the work of William Lilly, which of course is Renaissance astrology. And we used exclusively Regiomontanus houses for working with horary, and Regiomontanus worked just fine. So the point I'm trying to make in talking about all this is that in working with all of these various systems throughout the decades, I found that each of them worked fine. Even with horary readings, when I was working with Chris Brennan, we did horary readings with whole sign houses. I also did horary readings later when I was working with Warnock and the School of Traditional Astrology using Regiomontanus. I've seen people use Placidus and get good horary readings. It seemed that you could use any of these house systems as long as one decided in advance which house system one was going to use and stick to it. So this brings us to an interesting question. If in one house system we have, let's say, a stellium of planets in the 12th house, okay? And these planets shift most of the planets to the first house if we use another system. Which chart should we delineate? Have a look at this chart. Note how in this chart, Placidus, Saturn, the Moon, Mercury, and Pluto, and Venus are all in the 12th house. Here you see them here. But when we cast the same chart in whole sign houses, Saturn, the Moon, and Mercury all move over to the first house. So as you can see, the problem with the varying house systems is that they often put planets and other astrological symbols in different houses, thus making us unsure of which interpretation or delineation will be the correct one. Since obviously a planet situated in the 12th house means one thing, but if it is situated in the first house, the delineation will be quite different. How did we get into this situation? Why do we have different house systems in the first place? Why doesn't everybody just use the same house system and avoid these problems? Another question we might ask is, how and why do astrologers decide to use one house system over another? Well, as we saw in my case, many of us simply use the house system that we were trained with or that our teachers used. So if we're looking or studying at ancient astrology or Hellenistic astrology, we'll want to use whole sign houses, equal houses, or porphyry. If we're looking at medieval astrology, we'll probably want to use Alcabitius semi-arc. If we're doing Renaissance astrology, we'll probably want to use Regiomontanus. What are the differences between these various systems? To answer these questions, we need to look at how the house divisions are calculated. So for the second part of this talk, we're going to look at the three categories of house division, and then we'll take a tour of the celestial circles that are used to calculate the house divisions. So now we're at the second part of the talk, the categories of house division. The house system can be classified into three major categories. We have the ecliptic-based houses. These house systems divide the ecliptic itself. Whole sign houses, equal sign houses, and porphyry are in this category. And then we have the space-based houses. These systems divide space in the celestial sphere in various ways, and then determine how the resulting house cusps relate to the ecliptic. Campanus, Morinus, and Regiomontanus houses are all space systems. And finally, we have the time-based houses. These divide the time of the daily rotation of the Earth and then take the timing positions and project them in various ways to the ecliptic, which result in the various house cusp positions. Alcabitius, Kohn, and Placidus are of this type. In this diagram, we see the globe divided in half by the Earth's equator, which we defined as being at 0 degrees latitude. We divide the globe in half in a northern hemisphere, which is the hemisphere that is north of the equator, and a southern hemisphere, which is one that is south of the equator. The latitude specifies the location's distance north or south of the equator. The longitude specifies the location's distance east or west of an imaginary line connecting the north and south poles, which we call the prime meridian. Yes, that's the line that goes through Greenwich, England, the prime meridian. The lines that we see going parallel to the equator are called latitude lines. They are the lines that go from east to west or west to east, depending on how you want to look at it. In this diagram, we see the parallel latitude lines every 10 degrees moving north from the equator until we reach the North Pole, which is 90 degrees north of the equator. So here you see at the equator, it's 0 degrees, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 degrees in relation to the equator. The North Pole is always perpendicular or 90 degrees in relation to the Earth's equator, and the same goes for the South Pole. The parallel altitude lines going south of the equator on this map occur every 10 degrees until we reach the South Pole at 90 degrees south of the equators. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, with the South Pole perpendicular or 90 degrees in relation to the equator. So now we come to the lines of the longitude. These are the long lines that go north and south. These are these long lines here, going from the North Pole to the South Pole. In our geographical globe, we define the longitude lines going east or west of a longitude line, which is called the prime meridian. Oh, by the way, it was agreed by convention in the 19th century to call this line running through Greenwich, England, the prime meridian. So it's called that today. So these longitude lines are going either east of the prime meridian in this direction, or they're going west of the prime meridian in this direction. So on the map, you can see 10 degrees east of the prime meridian, 20 degrees east, 30 degrees east, and so on. 0 degrees of longitude for the prime meridian. This is 10 degrees west, 20 degrees west, 30 degrees west. Meridian or longitude lines run east of the prime meridian until they hit what is called the anti-meridian. Meridians also run west of the prime meridian until they reach the anti-meridian at 180 degrees. So with this system of coordinates using latitude, which are the lines parallel to the equator, and longitude, which are the lines going from the North to South Pole, we can pinpoint any geographical location on Earth. So here you see the North Pole, and these are the longitude lines, and here the line's going, this line is going west in relation to the prime meridian. So take a look at Washington, D.C. We can pinpoint exactly where it is using this system. It's 39 degrees north of the equator, which is at 0 degrees. So it's 39 degrees, and it's 77 degrees west of the prime meridian. And so with these two coordinates, 39 degrees north and 77 degrees west, we can pinpoint exactly where Washington, D.C. is. And these are the coordinates that we use for pinpointing the birthplace of a natal chart, where the native was born, what the latitude is, and what the longitude is. So now that we have reviewed how geographical locations on Earth are found, we can move on to how objects in space, such as planets and asteroids, are located. Let's go to the next slide. The first object that we need to define is the celestial sphere. The celestial sphere is the apparent surface of the heavens on which the stars seem to be fixed. All it really is an extension of the sphere of Earth, extended to infinity. For the purpose of establishing coordinate systems to mark the positions of the heavenly bodies, the celestial sphere can be considered a real sphere at an infinite distance from the Earth. So once again, all the celestial sphere is an extension into space of our geographical sphere, the planet Earth. The Earth's axis from the North to South Pole, extended to infinity, touches the celestial sphere, the north and south celestial poles around which the heavens seem to turn. The plane of the Earth's equator extended to infinity marks the celestial equator. So all the celestial equator is, it's the Earth's geographical equator, but it's extended out into outer space. The north and south celestial poles are simply the geographical north and south poles of the Earth, extended into space, which is why we call them celestial poles. This brings us to the next important celestial circle, the ecliptic. This is an important one to understand because it is the circle used as a reference in astronomy to pinpoint all the objects in the sky, and we use it in astrology to locate all the astrological objects and points, such as planets, the ascendant, the MC, the lots, the moon's nodes, the fixed stars, the vertex, and all the other sensitive points. The plane of the ecliptic is the apparent path that the sun makes around the Earth during the course of the year. So here you can see the little figure in the center. This is the observer from Earth, and the sun appears to move around the observer. So this is a geocentric point of view, but of course we know that the solar system is heliocentric. So in this illustration, we have the Earth revolving around the sun like this. And as it does so, from the point of view of the observer on Earth, we see the sun tracing a path around the zodiac with one constellation of stars per month appearing behind it. This apparent path that the sun takes is called the ecliptic. The next two great circles to consider are the meridian and the horizon. While we're doing it, we'll also look at the points of the zenith and the nadir. A geographical meridian or longitude line is an imaginary line from the North Pole to the South Pole, as we saw in our map of Washington, D.C. We draw these on maps to describe the position of a place. We can define the celestial meridian as a great circle of constant longitude of the celestial sphere, which passes through the zenith, the nadir, and the north and south points of the horizon. So here you see the circle on the diagram. This is the meridian, this purple line. And we'll start at the zenith, and it goes down through the celestial pole to the northern point in relation to the observer, all the way down to the nadir, up again to the southern point, and back again in a 360-degree circle to the zenith. On a standard astrological chart, the ecliptic and the meridian are pressed together so that they fit as a two-dimensional image. On the astrological chart on the right in this slide, we see the 360 degrees of the longitudinal positions of the ecliptic drawn on the circle. You can see them here in this chart, with the longitudinal position of the MC, that's this red line here, and the IC drawn upon it, thus superimposing these two circles that you see on the left-hand side. This is the ecliptic, this circle here, tracing the path of, apparent path of the sun. And this is the meridian defining the local longitudinal position of the observer on Earth. This perhaps would be a good time to point out that the MC and the zenith are two very different points. Our as the IC and the nadir. The zenith, this point over here, is the point in the sky 90 degrees above the local horizon. That is to say, it's directly above the observer's head. While the MC, this point over here, is the point in the sky where the sun crosses the local meridian. That is the definition of the MC. This is the highest point in the sky that the sun will reach at that particular latitude. But it's not because it's the sun's highest point in the sky that means it's the point that's directly over the observer's head. In fact, the only place on Earth where the sun would be directly overhead would be at the equator. So if you're not on the equator, the sun is going to be somewhat to the south if you're in the northern hemisphere, or somewhat to the north if you're in the southern hemisphere. In a similar fashion, the nadir is the point directly below the observer, while the IC is the point where the sun crosses the local meridian, the local longitude, at night. That will be its lowest point that the sun reaches at that particular longitude or meridian. Finally, we look at the ascendant. You'll notice that the ascendant is not necessarily due east of the observer. In fact, the only place the ascendant would be due east would be at the equator. We define the ascendant as a point where the ecliptic, the path of the sun, crosses the horizon, which in the northern hemisphere will be in a northeastern direction, and in the southern hemisphere will be in a southeastern direction. This brings us to the final celestial circle that we will look at, which is called the prime vertical. The prime vertical is defined as a great circle starting at the due east point of the observer, going through the zenith, down to the due west point, then down to the nadir, and up again to the eastern point. So here you see it on the chart. This circle here is what we call the prime vertical. And it goes from the eastern point, the point that is due east of the observer, in a 360-degree circle down to the nadir, the point directly below the observer, up again to the point that is due west of the observer, and up back again along the 360-degree circle to the zenith, the point directly above the head of the observer. I'd like to make a point at this juncture that the prime vertical, along with the meridian, are two celestial circles which tie the native of the chart very close to their geographical or geocentric position on Earth. The meridian does this because it defines the longitudinal position, the geographical longitudinal position of the observer. And so does the prime vertical, because by its very position, it's due east of the observer, and the meridian defines the longitudinal position of the place, the geographical place where the observer is standing or was born. This completes our tour of the great celestial circles. So let's sum up what we've talked about. We have the celestial sphere, which extends the sphere of the Earth into outer space, right? Then we have the celestial poles, which are extensions of the geographical north and south poles into outer space. That's all they are. And all the celestial equator is is an extension of the Earth's equator extended into space. The ecliptic, which is the sun's apparent path that it makes over the year around the Earth, and which is used to measure the longitudinal positions of all the astrological objects, is another circle that we discussed. We have the meridian, which is essentially the local geographical longitude extended into outer space. We have the local horizon. This is the boundary where the sky seems to meet the ground or the sea. This is another local circle that ties the observer to the Earth and defines the observer's position on the Earth. And finally, we have the prime vertical, which defines the due east and west points of the observer. Now let's move on to part 3 of this talk and take a more detailed look at the systems of house division with a view to understanding how they're calculated and how they might affect the symbolism of the horoscope. This is the end of the first 2 parts of this talk, which I'm recording for YouTube. I'll end the recording here, and the final part of the talk will be on the next video.